Hello everyone, and welcome to today's SANS webcast, Running a Better Red Team Through Understanding ICS SCADA Adversary Tactics. My name is Carol Auth of the SANS Institute, and I will be moderating today's webcast. Today's featured speaker is Robert M. Lee, Certified SANS Instructor and Course Author. If during the webcast you have any questions for Robert, please enter them into the questions window located on the GoToWebinar interface. We will be answering them during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. And with that, I'd like to hand the webcast over to Robert.
All right, thank you so much. Well, I appreciate you all tuning in today. I was really fortunate to be asked to do this by Ed and his folks. Ed obviously is queuing up his team for Hackfest. If you haven't been to Hackfest before, it's definitely worth checking out. I'm always sort of jealous. I'm over on the ICS and the forensic side, and we throw some pretty sweet conferences and summits and a lot of fun stuff. But every now and then Ed pulls out something at Hackfest, like renting out the entirety of the Air and Space Museum, things like that are just tons of fun. So yeah, so sort of kicking off the idea of doing Hackfest this year and his summit, I wanted to give a presentation, since I can't attend, on looking at ICS attacks and looking at the espionage efforts against industrial control systems, or ICS, and the type of infrastructure that runs our power grids, our water utilities, our oil pipelines. Look at sort of what adversaries are doing there to help you in terms of running a better red team. Now, I'm not going to go through, here is Kali Linux, here is different tools you can use. I'm not going to look at, how do you structure a red team. I want to take this next 55 minutes, this next 45 minutes, open up to questions, and really focus on what the adversaries have been doing. And I'll get to that here in a moment. Just for a quick introduction for myself, I'll note that I am not the other Rob Lee at SANS. So I always going to start this off and include my picture here, because there are two Rob Lees at SANS. Both of us started off in the Air Force. Both of us were in the intelligence community. Both of us were Denver Broncos fans. Both of us backgrounds in forensics. It gets a little silly. So Big Rob Lee #1, as the DFIR curriculum lead here at SANS. I mostly work on the ICS side, although I do have the cyber threat intelligence course on the forensic side as well. I also run a company called Dragos, where we do some fun stuff, but I'm not going to pitch you on it. What I want to focus on is my background in looking at and hunting for ICS threats in ICS environments, and bring some of that defender perspective on really what some red team focuses could help for, but also to bring in, again, some of that offensive perspective. I really do believe, sort of Ed's motto with Hackfest, that offense does inform defense. There at the last year of my career, the last 2 years of my career in the military, after my time in the intelligence community, I was benefited to be on an offensive team. Wasn't pen testing, wasn't a red team, but an actual military offense team going after locations. And seeing that offensive and defensive perspective was very beneficial. Now, I don't want anybody to be hacking infrastructure around the world and going on the offense, but that red team perspective is very, very beneficial for not only testing out our infrastructure, but for testing out our defensive teams as well. So a little bit of outline for what we're going to cover today. I'm going to start off, not spend too much time, but on two quick models. I'm going to talk about the sliding scale of cybersecurity and the ICS Cyberkill Chain, specifically to give a context to what I'm going to be briefing in the adversary tactics section. That'll be the heart of our presentation today, and then I'll end up leaving you with a slide on recommendations for the red teams based off of these adversary tactics, but I'll be sprinkling in those throughout as well. There have only been a handful of public case studies on different ICS attacks. You had the big one in Iran with Stuxnet, but then the other two pieces of ICS tailored malware out there were Havocs and Black Energy 2. We'll talk about Black Energy 2 as well as Black Energy 3. But the two attacks that we saw in the community outside of Iran was the German Steelworks attack in 2014 and the Ukraine attack in 2015. So I chose the two out of the three pieces of malware, Havocs and Black Energy 3, and then the actual attack from the Ukraine, which I was fortunate to work as an investigator, looking at writing the report and piecing things together from a lot of other good work in the community, and bring out sort of that perspective. So that's what we'll focus on today. So when we look at the models, the reason I like models is they allow us an opportunity to sort of abstract ourselves from data sets and pull out information. So what I'll note here with this sliding scale of cybersecurity is I put this together and I wrote a paper on it that you can reference as well. It's a SANS paper because I saw a lot of folks talking about security and saying, oh, well, I'm going to do something and invest in security, or I'm a cybersecurity person. What does that mean? You know, what exactly are you doing? What area are you focusing on? And what direction are you sort of driving the organization? And what I came to was really these 5 categories of potential investment. On the left-hand side of the scale, you have architecture. That's the building out the network with security in mind, the architecting it, networking, maintaining and patching it, the supply chain aspect, you know, the policies around it, etc. The step up from that is the passive defenses. You're putting your firewalls, your intrusion prevention systems, your antivirus, your endpoint agents, you know, your whatever next generation solution is on the market today. You're putting that there. That active defense component is when analysts are monitoring for, responding to, and learning from adversaries in their environment. It's the human component. It's threat hunters. It's incident responders. It's network security monitoring analysts. It's security operations folks. People who are focused on the threats and trying to find them in the environment. That intelligence aspect is generally around the idea of collecting data, exploiting it, and producing intelligence, but it can also be counterintelligence and sort of using intelligence in a variety of different ways that we'll talk about. And then lastly is that offensive component, which is those legal countermeasures. You know, when Sony gets compromised and if the United States government comes out and says it's North Korea and wants to do something against North Korea, you know, there are certain legal countermeasures in the international community that they have, technically a hack back. Now, it's got to be for security's sake, but I want to note 2 different things here. Number one, that hack back stuff is still offense. I see a lot of talk on this in terms of, well, we can do some cool things and maybe, you know, be light touch. No, it's still offense. But the other component that I want to bring out with the scale in general is that all the value towards security is trying to push things to the left-hand side. If an organization does their security investments correctly, they'll find that the return on investment for offense is ridiculous compared to actually tuning their firewalls, updating their systems, empowering their defenders, training their folks. So it really, when I put a lot of this together, it was to get us off this idea of offense and push us back to trying to do everything from the cyber hygiene type basics to building out those security teams and environments. Now, for our red team discussion, this is where it gets a little interesting. I don't want to counter anybody else's opinions from sort of the SANS crowd. The pen test group here is most certainly some world experts. That being said, from my perspective, when I think of a pen test, I think of validating architecture. Pen test is in that architecture category. It's seeing if the network is configured like it's supposed to be configured, if the patch is effective, is there a vulnerability, and can I exploit it? That's an architecture aspect, and it's very, very, very useful. From a red team perspective, that's in the intelligence category. That's a counterintelligence action. You are emulating a threat. You are saying, here is how the Ukraine power grid attack happened. Let me emulate that threat against your environment and see how you would respond. See how you do against this style of attack. So that's sort of the way that I draw the lines here. So when we're talking today and I'm showing these different adversary tactics, it's not from that is this exploitable architecture perspective. It's from understanding and emulating the threats that we've seen in the community. And threats being the humans and the capabilities and intent and opportunity they have, not just the malware, right? So the other thing to structure our discussion is this idea of the ICS Cyberkill Chain. There is almost no chance that you've been in this industry and haven't heard of the kill chain. And the kill chain's great and wonderful for a number of things. Sometimes some people get sort of phased out with it and maybe a little frustrated. But the reason I like it is the ability to structure and visually show sort of at a high level what's going on and to be able to put data into different little buckets, right? So as I have a pattern of delivery, how effective is that and what solutions am I putting in place to counter it? As I have patterns and multiple samples of C2, command and control, what am I doing to counter that and working? Now, on the ICS side, though, it's very similar, right, on the stage 1. So in the stage one, it's almost identical to the Lockheed Martin kill chain. The only difference is I put targeting there instead of just weaponization. You can do either or both. So if I have an unauthenticated VPN directly connecting me into a SCADA environment that actually has Windows 10 running with PowerShell, I don't need to really weaponize the VPN. I'm just logging in and using the PowerShell environment against you. I've targeted your environment, delivered, exploited the environment, even using native capabilities, maybe just modified instead of installing something. Maybe I didn't install malware, maybe I just modified how PowerShell is working in that environment. So those are the two tailorings that I made here. But the really heart and soul of it is the fact that industrial control system environments are very different than IT networks. We have physical components, we have networking gear and infrastructure that's a little bit abnormal, protocols that are different, and there's no commonality between all of the ICS sites. So if you wanted to target one substation for the electrical power grid in one portion of the country, it would be a very different way that you had to understand the ICS and the industrial, the control systems there than a different substation in a different part of the country. Different vendors, different configuration, different ways of being integrated. So to actually do that, if we're thinking of causing actual damage, outages, physical damage, maybe even just logical in terms of causing power to go down, water to stop, oil to stop flowing, etc., that's that stage 2. So all the stage 1 stuff is just getting you to the point where you understand the ICS well enough to impact it. Almost more engineering than cyber stuff. So in that stage 2, that's where you have to develop some sort of understanding to do the attack. It could be developing your knowledge against the ICS. It could be developing a specific capability for the ICS. But at some point you'll have to test it. Since these environments are so different, and because there are things that we can't plan for sometimes, there is a real requirement to test out knowledge and capabilities, especially for those large-scale attacks and things that we are more concerned about. Then there's that aspect of delivery, installation, modification, and attack. What I want to note here, and I'm going to flip back and forth rather quickly, is in this stage 1 to stage 2 style of effect, what this really means is that to impact industrial control systems, the attacker has to know more and has to do more to have a controlled effect. Can you get into an environment and cause some disruption just randomly? Sure. But if we're talking about attacks, especially those high confidence scenarios that we're concerned about, things that can cause real issues that aren't going to get stopped by a safety system or good engineering, there's this aspect of walking through and knowing more, which in my mind makes ICS environments some of the most defensible on the planet, which means red teaming to come in and figure out where the gaps are and help illuminate which steps we're not really taking care of or countering very well is extremely helpful. So let's jump into these adversary tactics and outline them against that kill chain model to talk about where you might take advantage of red teaming to test out the architecture, passive defenses, and active defenses of your defenders. So HAVEX. A little bit of background about HAVEX. It was your sort of run-of-the-mill remote access Trojan. What I liked about it most, and it's sort of harsh to say that I liked an adversary's capability, what I liked about it most was that it wasn't using 0 days and all sorts of fancy things. A lot of folks, when they think of the advanced actors and the well-funded teams, they think in terms of sophistication. I will tell you, having been on the government offensive teams, there's no bonus points for looking good in the Kaspersky report, right? The idea is do as little as possible, right? Do as little as you have to achieve operation efficiency. You want to be able to fly under the radar. You want to be able to achieve success, but if you look really, really sophisticated, at times that's an operational risk because then folks think it's really creative and cool, call in the specialized teams, maybe spend more time on it. But if you can get in with a basic methodology, you might fly under the radar even if you do get caught. And that's basically what HAVEX did. It operated from 2013 to 2014, and there were thousands of industrial control system sites around the world that were compromised. Effectively, they used 3 different styles of intrusion. There was the normal run-of-the-mill spear phishing, the waterhole attack, which all that really was is they targeted ICS vendor websites, and as ICS companies came and looked at the web page, they were compromised with well-known exploits. It was at some points copy and pasted Metasploit modules, not very advanced at all. Now the one that was more interesting was Trojanized ICS software installers. The reason this is interesting is in industrial control system facilities, we often have different ways of segmenting out our environments. And sometimes people don't do this, but in some facilities, in a lot of facilities, we try for what we call the Purdue model. And in this environment, we try to have a difference between the business network, a difference between the plant network, the DMZ, and actually when you start getting down into the ICS and the control areas. And my point in saying this is if you're spearfishing, you're going to land in the business networks. If you're doing a water hole attack, you might land in the DMZ at best. But if you actually do the Trojanized ICS software installers, you can actually get into the industrial control networks themselves. And so we saw this evolution in the Adversary campaign almost as if they were realizing that as well. Maybe they were, but we can't assume intent based off of just what we saw. So we did see them get into industrial control system environments through that last phase of that Trojanized ICS software installer and having folks run that capability for them in these environments. The impact was espionage. There was a massive amount of sensitive data stolen off these environments, and it effectively mapped out the environments. If I mapped out your IT enterprise environment, that map might not be useful in 6 months, a year, definitely not 5 years. In an industrial control system environment, we don't change a lot of stuff too often. It's unique and weird, but once you map it out, that map might be good for 5, 10, 15 years. So these espionage efforts have a lot of value in the long term for these operational groups. So when we look at it compared on that ICS kill chain, we saw we assumed that there was reconnaissance done at some point. They were going after the right vendor websites, right folks. There was this weaponization that took place both in the spear phishing email, the Trojanized files, the water hole, the delivery based off of either the emails, the ICS files, or the web pages. The exploitation was those Metasploit modules when they took place. Sometimes it was something as simple as opening up the files natively. The installation, right, the HAVEX malware itself, which then connected up to command and control servers, and the action in this case was stealing off data. At some points, it was just sending out random requests to industrial control system ports to see if there was information that could be obtained. In other cases, it was using a protocol called OPC, this Open Platform Communications protocol that was being used to pull off data relevant to the industrial control system components themselves. So from a red team perspective, this is probably, for most of you, very similar to what you do in an IT network. The delivery, the exploitation, the installation, the C2, all of that should sound pretty normal. The interesting piece from the ICS focus was, number one, knowing where you're going to land up with the different methodologies. If the defenders go to the web page, you're going to land up in the business network or the DMZ. If you get the Trojanized files, they might be more susceptible to getting their supervisory network or control elements compromised. Testing out to that can help reveal those weaknesses that maybe the defenders have. The most important piece, though, was what they did at the action. And this, to me, from HAVEX, and the reason I chose it, is where you could get testable qualities for an industrial control system red team. If you look at the pre-HAVEX network off to the left, it's nothing more than a Wireshark capture of a little network I stood up and pre-infection. It was using port 502 and then high-level ports on .200. .200 was the human-machine interface, the HMI. The .30, .31, 32, and 33 were Modbus TCP-based controllers. So they're physical controllers that you could use to do sensing and actuation in an environment, 502 being the port for Modbus TCP. If you infect the network with one of the modules of HAVEX, specifically the ICS scanner, I think it was module 44, when you looked at the same environment, very quickly you can identify 44818 pops up, 12401 pops up, 11234, port 102. What was interesting about this is these are all ICS related ports. 44818 being Ethernet IP as an example, 102 being ISO TSAT for either the Step 7 protocol or for the ICCP protocol. So we start seeing this ICS flavor. So the question from a red team could easily be, if I do nothing more than send SYN packets to these ICS related ports on the network, whether they're open or not, could defenders detect that? Because in an ICS, we don't have a whole lot of logging and host-based agents, and there's definitely not, antivirus and a bunch of other stuff running around. One of the things that we test and train our active defenders on is if they can use network security monitoring tactics. Can they monitor the environment to know that .30 never uses any other port than 502? Now the question then becomes, can my red team understand what the ICS ports are to send out tailor-crafted SYN packets and an environment that you've already tested and understand that it can support it to these ICS ports to determine if the defenders can see this? And more importantly, in my opinion, if the defenders do see this, do they realize there's an ICS tailored component to what you're doing? So if a piece of malware got in an environment and started scanning around for port 80, I have a different level of response if I think that it might be IT malware. But if I'm a defender and I start seeing ICS-specific responses, like ICS-specific ports, even if I'm not using those ones, I'm now very concerned. You'll also note off to the right that in ARP requests, the malware, before it scanned anything, just ARP mapped the network. And it did it by standing out who has .5, .55, .105, .155, .205. Well, okay, who has .6, .56, .106, .156, .206. It was a slower, stealthier way of mapping out the network with something as simple as an ARP scan. You're not going to drop, and you still want to test it, right? You always got to test what you're doing in lab environments before you do anything in an ICS, but you're not going to drop an ICS controller simply by lightly ARP scanning the network generally. Can you do that, and can your defenders detect you? Since you're not going to be running up against as many products in the ICS environment, not as many solutions and endpoint agents and things like that, the question is, can my defenders detect it, that active defense component, and how long can they detect it, and what do they do once they detect it? So these are all great testable qualities from Havex as an example. Now if we move to Black Energy 2 and Black Energy 3, this was the third piece of ICS malware that we found in the community. In 2014, iSight ended up uncovering it. It was targeting not only energy sites, but NATO sites, telecom sites, and other places around the world. They named it as the Sandworm campaign. And it was the same kind of thing, right? Leveraging spear phishing emails to gain access. This time there were macro-enabled Word documents and PowerPoints and themes of the PowerPoints for energy, like oil fracking and power problems. There was a 0-day this time, especially for the enterprise IT side of the house with Windows systems. But in Black Energy 2, there were also ICS exploits, specifically for those human-machine interfaces connected up to the internet. Those internet-connected devices are always going to get folks in trouble. I generally will take Shodan and then plug the Shodan data into a tool like Maltego and try to reveal what those internet-connected devices are for any given facility and show them what their information attack space looks like as far as their internet-connected control systems go. The impact of Black Energy 2 and Black Energy 3, though, both were just about remote access, credential theft, and general espionage. However, we're going to be talking about a case coming up with Ukraine where Black Energy 3 was used as a starting point that then pivoted into an actual attack, not espionage. But if we look at Black Energy 2 and Black Energy 3 from the industrial control system component, it was a pretty targeted campaign. Now what was useful is, after they landed with emails in the business network, the actors would harvest off credentials and then start pivoting through the environment. So they were able to make it down not only to the supervisory control elements, but also into the control elements themselves. So not only the SCADA server, but down into interfacing with control systems like program logic controllers or remote terminal units themselves. So there was a greater access once that human component of the campaign was involved to move the actors into the environment. This was usually done through trusted network channels. So folks in these ICS environments have to move data from the control elements, from the supervisory and sort of SCADA networks up into the business networks. If a power company wants to bill customers, they have to know how much power is generated and consumed. So being able to do that means there's trusted access paths. In addition, if vendors want to be able to do remote maintenance of this equipment, they also have to be able to come in, usually through VPNs. So from a red team perspective, in that stage 1 component, being able to not only test out your normal sort of can you detect phishing emails and things like that, but can you detect the abuse of trusted pathways, those unauthenticated VPNs, or maybe single access instead of two-form authentication VPNs. The data historian that's moving information from the supervisory portion of the network into the DMZ? Can the connections of those systems be abused, and can the defenders notice it? Well, the spoiler alert answer is yes, all of those connections can be abused and will be, but most importantly, what architecture, passive defenses, and active defenses are put in place and test them correctly. From that testable qualities, so there's a great value, right, in terms of those spear phishing emails and customer awareness and education for your users. It's always nice to be able to test that stuff out. What I want to note here, though, from the network perspective, and I try to focus something differently than Havex this time, is on the network perspective, when Black Energy 2 and 3 were in environments, they would connect out to various servers and do things like an NTP check, like network time protocol check. But all these servers, like the 64 server, that's just Windows, like, right? It's different Microsoft Update servers, which seems kind of ridiculous. Why am I focusing on this? Well, in industrial control system networks, we shouldn't see something as simple as Bing.com, Google.com, WindowsUpdate.com, or whatever it is, right? We shouldn't see generally these network connections originating from the industrial control system environments and trying to get out. So something as simple in a red team environment of sitting on the SCADA network and doing almost legitimate connections out of the environment to different internet locations to try to test to see if you have connectivity. Obviously the malware did this to connect to the internet to make sure that it had internet connectivity before it ended up going to its command and control servers. So without even standing up specific command and control servers, can you go to legitimate websites in an environment that normally shouldn't be going to these, and can the defenders detect them? It's almost trivial at this point, but it's a good check to be able to test your ICS defenders on. All right, so Ukraine power grid. This is a bulk portion of the presentation. This one was a great case because so far we've only talked about the stage 1 stuff. The Ukraine power grid scenario transitioned in that stage 2. So what I need you to understand before we talk about it is really just the background on a power grid. A power grid at a high level generally has at least 3 components: generation, transmission, and distribution. We're going to generate through wind, thermal, hydro facilities, coal-fired facilities, etc., nuclear energy. I'm going to generate power. I'm going to transmit this bulk amount of power across large regional locations, and then I'm going to step it down and distribute it through towns and commercial cities and places like that. You'll also generally have control centers at different levels, maybe for transmission sites as well as distribution sites, that keep everything flowing. And at the control center is also where you'll have that SCADA server, right? The SCADA environment that's watching and monitoring and making sure everything's working correctly. It's like the boss in the office, right? So in Ukraine, what happened is on December 23rd, 2015, attackers broke into these facilities. They had already been there for 6 months, actually, but they broke in 6 months before, and on December 23rd, 2015, they started taking down and disconnecting substations at that distribution level. So we're disconnecting substations one by one from these little distribution control centers. So they hit the first control center, disconnected the substations, hit the second control center, disconnected substations, and then hit the third one and disconnected those substations. It was about 30 minutes apart each, and ultimately 225,000 customers were left without power for around 6 hours until the network engineers and system engineers and ICS engineers and operators could get the power back up. But what was important is sort of how they walked through and how they did that. So we look at the ICS Cyberkill Chain. I'm not going to go over everything. The full report's up there in the corner for you. Sort of the official report in the community was written by myself, Mike Asante, and Tim Conway, and released out through SANS as well as the ISAC. And it details everything with mitigations. Let's walk through what's most relevant from the red team perspective. When the adversaries sort of went after this environment, that stage 1 occurred 6 months before the actual attack. They sent spear phishing emails. It was Microsoft Office documents like PowerPoints and Word documents that had macros enabled. When the users clicked open on the documents, it said, hey, do you want more features? Would you like some extra features? And all the users like, totally want more features, clicked enable on macros, which of course dropped Black Energy 3 to the system. So deliver, exploit, the exploitation there was the social engineering. the installation with Black Energy 3, the command and control servers that it connected up to, right? So connected up to various command and control servers. And the action in this was allowing remote access and credential theft. So the attackers moved in, pivoted around the environment, and looked for credentials that could be leveraged against the ICS networks. Most importantly, they looked for VPNs from the business networks into the industrial control system environments and into the control environments for these control centers. So that allowed them to pivot to that stage 2. What they did as they were wrapping up the stage 1 over the course of 6 months is they made sort of their inventory of the environment. They figured out what the environment was using. They figured out the different control environments, the different systems on the network. They realized that there was 3 different distribution management systems, so 3 different environments that were spread out across these 3 different facilities to be able to control the substations. And they developed knowledge of how to interface with each one of these so that they could use the system against itself to remotely disconnect the substations. When they developed that knowledge, they would have had to test what they were doing at some point, but we know a little bit more about what they tested because they also found what's called a serial to Ethernet device. Basically, they found equipment that acted as a bridge between the control center and the remote substations out across different portions of Ukraine. These serial to Ethernet devices take the control center IP protocols and data and translate it into serial protocols for the control elements at the substations. So they found what those were, and they developed specific malicious firmware against all of these different little, around 57 of these little serial to Ethernet devices, so that when the attack came time to do the attack, when they ultimately took the substations offline and disconnected them, they also bricked the serial to Ethernet devices, so there was no way to remotely bring them up. But they also delivered some other good stuff for the attacker, for the defenders. Not only could you say that they delivered themselves, they had the remote desktop access to the human-machine interfaces, and remote desktop assistant was enabled, but they also delivered a piece of malware called Kill Disk across the Windows environment of the SCADA system, around 900 different systems to be in fact, where they deployed this Kill Disk malware, which upon reboot would delete the master boot record or logs off of the environment. They also modified the network UPS, and when the power went out across Ukraine, made sure that power went out across the control centers as well after rebooting the systems to trigger Kill Disk, and they dropped the network interface card on the UPS so that if you did get up some systems, you wouldn't be able to remotely go back in and turn on the UPS or turn on any of the systems or unschedule what they had scheduled. So the execution of the ICS attack itself was executing the firmware attack, executing the Kill Disk attack, but also actually disconnecting the substations through learning how to use the ICS. Now this is an important concept here. It wasn't that the attackers used malware. Malware alone wouldn't have done much to these environments. If you took out the SCADA environment, the power grid would still work. It's not ideal. You lose automation, but the power and lights don't just go out because the SCADA environment went out. What was important here is the attackers learned how to use the industrial control system environment against itself. Black Energy 3 enabled the access, Kill Disk amplified the effect, but it was really the knowledge of the attackers in the industrial control system environments that allowed them to disconnect the substations in the first place. So from a red team perspective, the things that I think is very important to take away is getting intimately familiar with that ICS and thinking about how it would be turned on itself. How would you sit down and use the industrial control system environment against itself? When you're sending legitimate commands, there's no AV, endpoint agent, whatever else is going to stop those legitimate commands because they're by nature legitimate. So if an attacker issues a legitimate command about disconnecting a substation, which an operator might need to do at some point, there's no product that then stops that. So can you do that? What would it look like? And how would defenders respond? Is there a sort of cyber readiness level of the ICS? A good red team takeaway, in my opinion here, and a good thing to teach the defenders would be, hey, look, the first control center in your network gets hit. The second control center across a different region gets hit. Well, before the third one is delivered, do you really need internet access right now? Do you really need remote desktop assistant enabled? Can we have a temporary hardening profile for certain features that we turn off that facilitate better defense and a better response sort of posturing before the attack. And to be able to test that as a red team, again, very, very important. So what are some of those testable qualities in Ukraine? Well, we saw that remote VPN usage be taken advantage of. In an ICS environment, VPNs are common. However, it's not common for it to be high spikes in usage. So that's also not common to be leveraged for a couple minutes at a time. If someone's coming in to do remote maintenance, you might expect them to be there for 2, 3, 4 hours at a time, not 10 minutes on the network then jump off. So from a defender perspective, they'd be needing to monitor the VPNs. So from a red team perspective, can you do something that won't affect the ICS at all? Can you just start logging into VPNs? Can you just do it more common, more often? Can you do it with random session links? Can you do this and have them notice you? Is that something that they would notice at all? The firmware updates. There are no reasons out there that firmware updates should be taking place during operations. In other words, the power grid operators, if the engineers need to do a firmware update, that's going to be in a maintenance period where the station is down, right? It's not going to be done while power is being transmitted and distributed. So could you see this on the network? Could you stop it? Could you ensure that only specific systems are allowed to do firmware updates and only certain times a year is when they're maintenance periods? Remote desktop. Could you identify that the remote desktop assistant is not needed at all the time, and that it definitely shouldn't be used at every single system across 3 control centers simultaneously? The harder one is legitimate commands. And this, to me, is really an aspect of traceability. Even if the legitimate commands can get issued at that end of the ICS Cyberkill chain, can the operators go back after the fact to logs and information to know exactly what commands were issued and when? So from a red team perspective, it's something useful to be able to do. Now, the testing of that gets very difficult, and this is going to get where we talk about recommendations. So let me get to our sort of last slide here of these recommendations for folks. Sorry, I jumped ahead. I have one more slide before the last one. I want to note that most of the stage 1 stuff is traditionally your Windows environment, enterprise network, maybe getting into the DMZ or the supervisory network. When you talk about stage 2 attack, it's really that level 2, 1, and 0, that control elements, the physical equipment. So a lot of your red team skills translate very well into stage 1. The focus, though, is on what can you learn about the ICS, including pathways and access points to get into. From there, the attack, the ability to cause an impact, is really engineering and sort of ICS knowledge. So my recommendations as we end this out, and then I'll open up to questions. Number 1, safety and reliability are paramount, but that requires coordination. The people that will authorize you to take actions may not actually have coordinated, and they should, hopefully, but may not have actually coordinated correctly with everyone on site. I really don't like the idea of a blind red team assessment of an ICS environment. There's too many things that can go wrong with physical sort of consequences. So I look for coordination, and I look to be able to test those defenders. Since I'm not too concerned about the products on the network and testing those, I might be for gaining access to the environment, the VPNs, the tunneling, but there's not so many products in the ICS itself. What I really care about in the red team assessment, that counterintelligence focus, is on my active defenders. Can they see it? Will they detect it? How long do they detect it? And what do they do when they do? So it's okay to have coordinated and just see if they can actually run through and see this. I usually ask for my red teams to start off with a tabletop exercise. It's very useful to sit down and ask the questions first. It not only allows you to understand where the weaknesses might be and what things you need to focus on, but also to challenge different notions. Your ICS asset owner might say, well, we're not connected to the internet, or we don't have remote VPNs, and so you couldn't get access anyways. And then to be able to show that you can is a very important takeaway for them to note that they don't have the visibility across the ICS that they thought they did. You know, a good question might be, could you see this if it occurred to you? I've had facilities already, and we've started seeing red teams against ICS environments mimicking the Ukraine attack, and say, if the Ukraine attack happened against you, the same style, the methodologies, the tactics, the techniques, the procedures being the same, what impact could it achieve? Could it happen to you, and what would you do? How would you respond? Being able to roll down that almost in sort of a checklisted out function is a really valuable takeaway for a red team for an ICS environment. but it's not about throwing Metasploit modules. It's not about seeing if you can get a shell on the PLC, and it's not about seeing if you can, do DNS exfil off of a control system, because those aren't the tactics that we're seeing from a red team perspective. Those are things that might be forward-leaning. We want to get there. We want to see cool things and help out. But being informed by what's actually happening in the ICS environment, what we generally see is a lot of stage 1 activity to learn the ICS and then using the ICS against itself. Learning the ICS environment so well and persisting for so long that you could build up the knowledge to bring it down, that you know the physical safety systems that are in the way from the design engineering documents that would stop overpressurization of a certain pipeline. You can answer these type of questions from learning the environment. Now, the other thing that I'll sort of leave you with is too is it's obviously very, very critical to test these things out. Finding a lab network if possible, a maintenance period, some environment where you can go and do all of this when it's not active operations is going to be extremely important, because you definitely don't want to be the guy or gal that takes down the portion of the power grid testing around on systems that were there for sort of purpose of defending and training. So I'll give you one story and then we'll open up to questions of sort of how this can go, how important it is to learn the ICS. So I got called in one time specifically to more or less babysit a pen tester. And I was like, what? And they were like, we need you, the facility said, we need you to come in and just walk around, make sure this guy doesn't destroy anything. I said, okay, he's probably qualified, and if you're calling him in. And they're like, no, we have to have an annual pen test. It's going to be valuable. We'll take it seriously, but I just need to make sure he doesn't destroy anything. I'm like, sure, whatever, that's fine. And I had nothing to do, and it was local to my town, and I kind of like infrastructure, water, power, oil, etc. So I followed this guy around. He was doing everything okay. It was very IT-centric. He wasn't doing a whole lot of cool ICS stuff. Wasn't really testing out the adversary capabilities. It was a pen test, not a red team. But he was good. So he gets to the sort of meeting, the end of the exercise, the end of his 2 weeks there. He goes and presents, and he's got everybody in the boardroom, right? It's the CSO, it's the chief of engineering, it's a lot of folks that are excited about seeing what happened. And this guy is eating it up. He is arrogant. And I know none of you have ever met an arrogant pen tester or defender before. Nobody arrogant, possibly, in any role of security. This dude was arrogant. And he was like, oh, yeah, I mean, I could have totally taken down this whole operation. And he, flips around his laptop, and he has a human machine interface up that he actually had remote access to. He's like, if I push this button right here, boom. Everyone just starts looking around like, is this guy serious? And the lead engineer, without missing a beat, says, push it. And I'm like, whoa, hold on, guys. Like, hey, I don't really believe this guy that he's going to blow up something from pushing the button, but hey, maybe we shouldn't test it on live equipment. And the engineer's like, nah, push it. And Chief Information Security Officer does not hold the power in that situation, right? The Chief of Engineering, the lead engineer, is the boss in that situation. And so the pen tester's starts to protest a little bit, and the engineer nags him on. Finally, he's like, screw it, and pushes it, and nothing happens. Without missing a beat, the engineer goes, boom. He goes, well, Sonny, and this was as degrading as you could possibly imagine, but the engineer replies, well, Sonny, what your Nmap scans didn't reveal is we've got these valves on the pipeline that if you try to overpressurize it, it just opens up the physical valve, and we just let off all that hot air. I was like, oh man, it was a pretty good burn for the meeting. But the point in saying this, and the reason I bring it up, is those physical drawings, that understanding of the physical safety systems, the overpressurization valves, things like that, aren't going to be revealed on that IP scan. And sometimes even in mapping an ICS network can go horribly wrong and take down sensitive equipment anyway. The point is staying in a stealthy manner, learning from the adversary tactics that we see in the community, and understanding the ICS as well as its physical components and what can go wrong and what can be tested out safely to show that maybe the operators, engineers, or defenders don't fully understand their environment. That is the value in a good red team. That is the value in testing out those defenses. And their best defenses aren't the firewalls. Their best defenses are their people, and showing that opportunity for education with their people. So with that, I'm going to turn it over. We've got just a couple minutes for questions. We got to get out here a little bit early for the webcast day, as I know it's the end of the day for most of you, so I appreciate you sticking around. But feel free to start asking your questions now. I've got a couple, so I'll start with the first one. So the first thing is, what's the worst thing I've ever seen happen with a red team assessment? Nothing in terms of loss of life or limb. It's not as scary, right? They've designed these systems to be safe from a safety perspective, even if they don't design them to be secure. We definitely got to do better in that area. But I have seen, pen testers or red team members come in and take down systems, right, to do an in-map scan, and didn't understand that sending random packets and scans across the network could stop sensitive controllers. And so I've seen million-dollar impacts off of stupid scans and environments, and have cost the facility greatly. So insurance is a really big thing for red teams, of course, but also getting good authorization on what you can and can't do in those environments. I got a question here. Did they catch the Ukraine guys? Yeah, so they didn't. Right now, the understanding in Ukraine, sort of what's been pontificated by the community and who the Sandworm team is that it was the Russian government. I actually don't agree. I don't think we have enough evidence to say that. However, the attribution, sort of motivation, and what was achieved, and timing and location and things like that definitely aligns. So I think that the Russian government at some level may have known about it, maybe even funded it, but I don't know that we can just say government. Most people think of funded teams and they think governments, but we're seeing more and more companies do these things as well. IT hacking team, Gamma Group, different companies around the world that are selling, selling these type of capabilities, selling operations. We've seen them sell things to the governments before. I think there is a high chance, and again, we don't have a whole lot of evidence around this, but I think there's a high chance that maybe a funded team was carrying out operations at the request of a government, potentially Russia, but I didn't find enough in terms of what we saw from the evidence to definitively say it had to have been the Russian government. I think it occurred out of Russia, though, and I cannot imagine a scenario where operations were being conducted against civilian infrastructure out of the Russian border and the government didn't know about it. It would be unfathomable to me that could occur without the Kremlin's knowledge. So I don't think we let them off the hook in terms of the international community. I think that there's geopolitical sort of pressures and responses and things that we have to do, things that were definitely missed opportunities, in my opinion, on coming out and making a big stand about how attacking civilian infrastructure is not okay. But there was not enough proof in my mind to actually say definitively this is any given government. But again, I think that's part of the problem. So I got a response from Steven. You seem to disagree with me. Feel free to follow up on why you disagree, but I worked the case. There wasn't enough to say it was the Russian government. So let's see. We got another question here. How can we set up a basic lab for ICS SCADA to start? Good one, real good one. What I like to see is not a huge investment in tens of thousands of dollars worth of control systems. And that's usually where a lot of people start. Well, let me save a bunch of money and try to figure out ways to buy a bunch of physical control systems. It's useful. What I like to see instead is start small. I would say grab some Raspberry Pis and set them up to run Modbus TCP clients and see how you can interface with it and what you can learn. Then move up and grab some equipment maybe off eBay. What most folks won't tell you is it's not just about the control systems that are physical, it's about the applications that run them, and that can be the most expensive part sometimes. So when you're looking for good rugged equipment that has software that I would consider obtainable and not in the tens of thousands of dollars, RS Logix, Phoenix Contact, these type of equipment, Phoenix, Siemens, and RS Logix all have couple $100 versions of control systems that you could interface with, learn the logic on, see how ladder logic works, and start interfacing with them. On the education piece, obviously we teach that out on the ICS curriculum side about how to build and secure these systems and defend them. But on getting started with a basic lab, I'd start small, Raspberry Pis, move up to eBay type equipment, move up to control systems that you buy from the vendor and just get them networked together. Build out a small lab based off that Purdue structure that I showed you. So Google the Purdue model and build out like a domain controller for the business network with some Windows VMs. Build out a DMZ into a plant environment where you've got some software that's interfacing with the control system, and start seeing how you can pen test and move around and get to working with those. All right, that's actually all the questions that came through, which is ending us about a couple minutes early, which is useful. I know most of you are hanging at the end of a long day, so I appreciate you hanging in there. And thank you so much for attending. I would leave you with little Bobby comics. These are comics that I always write to keep my sanity and information security, so I'll leave you with one of them. Put my Twitter handle down there as well as the comic. I would also encourage you to follow the SANS pen test group, especially for Hackfest. It's going to be a whole heck of a lot of fun. I am extremely jealous that I can't make it this year. We have one last question. We have a couple of questions coming in at the very end. What if you encounter an air gap? There are some facilities that actually do have an air gap. I know it's mostly a myth in the community. People think they have an air gap and they don't. At best, they have sort of a high latency network. But generally, there's different ways to move through it, USBs. But also, there's a lot of times they think they have an air gap and they just don't. But if you actually do find an environment where they have it, look to see where you have data moving in and out of the environment. They have to at some point. It might be USBs, it might be data diodes, but there's data flowing in and out of the environment. And also look for where sensitive ICS data is stored outside of the ICS. You might have system engineering drawings and documents and sensitive ICS related data in the DMZ that's not part of the air gap. But generally speaking, the air gap fails pretty commonly in the community because data access is needed, and the boardroom is pushing that into the audit, into the community to be able to have more and more visibility and access. And then the last one, let's see. Replay of this is available. This and the slides will be available afterwards. Carol's going to take it from here. So Carol, if you wouldn't mind, go ahead and close this on out.
All right, thank you so much, Robert, for your great presentation, which helps bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, you can visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.